Hello everyone and welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial, we will be creating an events application which would allow an admin to be able to add events to SQLite database. We want to give them the opportunity to add an event with a name, time, information, a venue, and we can have extra columns that we ourselves want to add to the table as well. And then what we want to do is we want to allow the user to be able, the admin to be able to delete a new event from the database. We want to allow the organizer to update an existing event. We want the organizer to be able to, delete like just an event in general. And the organizer should also be given the option to update their personal details. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build a part where it allows the organizer to be able to add the events, be able to delete the events, be able to update the events. We're going to do it. Well, we're going to do it rather than using list views and recycle views. For the first part of it, we're going to use edit boxes to do most of the work. For a user to be able to view it, we'll give the user the option of viewing it in a list, or we can even give the user the opportunity of viewing it in general. So there are several things that we're going to cover here in what we are going to be doing. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. I'll be taking you through step by step. So please, if you're not sure about anything, please feel free to actually read it, look through over and over again in order for you to be able to understand. Okay, so let's go to our first thing we're going to do is we are going to create our SQLite DB handler or DB connects. So let's create a DB connect file class. So DB connect class, and we're going to extend the SQLite database. And when we extend the SQLite database, Android Studio would want us to sorry, not SQLite database, SQLite open helper, sorry. Let's select open helper. And then we're going to implement our methods on create and our on upgrades. And then we are going to add a class to it, sorry, a constructor to it. We're going to select the first one that we're seeing here. And in our constructor, I'm just going to be working with just context. I'm not going to pass in any name or factories or etc. etc. I'm going to remove factory and set it to null because we're not going to use any factory, etc. And the database version, we will change that once we create the attributes for this SQLite open helper. Sorry. So what some of the attributes that we're going to have in our SQLite open helper is private, static. We need to create these fields that comes along with it. So in our case, let's say we want to create a private int. Let's start with the DB version first, equals to 1. A private static string, DB name, which is going to be our database name. So let's call it events manager. And then we're going to create a private static string, DB table, table that we're going to connect to. So let's call this our events. And then, let's call this TBL events. And then let's call this DB, just events manager is fine. And then private static, we're going to create our columns now. String, we're going to have an ID. So ID. Private static string, our our columns need to have an event name. So we will have event name equals event name, private static string. Then we want to have an event time equals event time, private static string. We want to have event information because every event would have its own information equals, and then we will have event information. And then private static string event venue, so that we'll know where to go. We can't just turn up to a venue. We can't just go to an event that we don't know where it's being held. Private static string. There are extra columns we can add for now. I'm not going to add any extra columns for now. I'm just going to go ahead and create my methods, or I'll be working with. Okay, so in my name, I'm going to change that to the DB name. That's the database name. And the version, I'm just going to pass in the DB version in case the version changes. Let's see why it's giving us an error. Cannot reference DB version before super constructor is called. Let me have a look as to why it's giving me this whatever. Okay, it's fine. Even if I have a DB version, we can just let's enter one for now. It's not an issue. Or let's see if we can add a static to it, and then we can pass in the DB version here. Okay, shouldn't be an issue. Then what we're going to do is we're now going to create our query. So string query. This is very similar to our previous tutorial on creating an address book manager. So if you look at the address book manager, if you've already done the address book manager, this one should be quite familiar to you. If you haven't done it before, it's fine. We're creating it the same way, so it wouldn't really make a big difference. I'm just going to be creating my table. I'm creating a query in my own create method. Create table, DB table, and then we are going to now create our columns. We're going to add our columns to it. So the first column that we're going to have is we are going to have our ID, which is the first thing, our ID. And our ID is going to be of an integer. It's going to be auto incremented. So let's import this here. And it's also going to be a primary key. I want that to be our primary key. And then next thing we're going to do is we are going to create we're going to add our column to it. So our events name column, and then we are going to leave a gap there. It's going to be a type of a text. It's going to be of a text. So we have space there, a text. And then we're going to do the next one, which is going to be our event time. And that's also going to be of a text. And then we are going to do the same thing for our event information. And that's also going to be of a text. And then we are going to do the last bit, which is the event venue. And that is also going to be of a text. So what we have here currently is we have create table events, make the ID an integer and a primary key. The event name is text. The event time is a text. The event information is a text. The event venue is also a text, sorry. And then we're going to run our query, SQLite database dot execute, and we're going to pass in our query. That is our onCreate method done. And then we're going to do our onUpgrade. On upgrade, we're just going to pull SQLite database dot execute SQL. I'm going to do drop table if exists. So if the table exists, and we change the version, we might drop it. So it's passing our DB table. And then we have to execute. Let's pass in our onCreate, and then SQL database. So if the table already exists, we should drop the one we're about to create. Okay. We're not going to upgrade anything in there. We're not going to change our database. We're not going to upgrade our database because we haven't made any changes to our database column, but we can set if and else statements in case we made some adjustments to our tables or databases, and the user had the previous one, had a previous database that they were using. So what I'm going to create now is a method to add to our events table. But before we do that, what I want to do now is I would like to create a class, and that class is going to help us to be able to add to the database, delete from the database. So if you click on .com example, whatever you give your application name, and you click on new, and you click on Java class, I'm going to call mine event. Should we call it events or events? Let's call it events. And then inside events, I'm going to create some attributes. So private, let's say int ID, private string, and let's say we can have strings of whatever we had before, which is the events name, private string, event time, private string, event information, private string, event venue. So these are the columns that is currently required for our application. So what we've done is we've created our attributes, our column names, which we're going to be using later on. So I now want to create getters and setters, which I don't want to create myself. I want Android Studio to help me create it. Is I'll click on generate or alt insert. So if I click on alt insert, okay, alt insert didn't work in this case. Okay, let's do it manually. So I click on generate. Let's go to getter and setter. I want to create a getter and setter for all of these attributes. So when I click OK, Android Studio creates these getters and setters for me. And then I want to create a constructor. So I go to generate, click on constructor, and I want to create a constructor with all of the attributes. And Android Studio creates a constructor for me. Okay, so that is how we create a normal, simple class, which is going to help us with our events application. Okay, so back to our DB Connect. So we've got our onCreate, we've got an onUpgrade sorted. Now I want to create a method that would help us to be able to add to our SQL database. So in my case, what I'm going to have here is public void add address book. So we have, well, add events. I still have address book in my head, so we're changing that to events. So add events, and then with our public void dot add events, what we want to do is want to pass in our events class. Yes, our event class. I'm thinking if I should change the name from events to event, but it's fine. Events is fine. We'll keep events for now. So then we'll have to create an object from our SQLite database, which works along with our SQLite helper. So then this dot get writable database, because we're about to write to a database, we've got to create an object from the SQLite database. And then what we have to do is we have to now use content values. Now, content values works with key value pairs. So it matches up our keys and our values together, and then we'll be able to insert that into our database. So I'm creating a new content values. And then I am going to create, I'm going to now put some values in there. So values dot put, the name can be anything. You don't have to use the word value. I'm more using values because it goes along with content values. So values put, and then what I'm going to do here is the name of our first column, which is an, I think events name, comma, because it's a key and value pair. So the first one is the key and the second part is the value. Android Studio tells you exactly what it is. So you have string key, string value, string key, byte value. So it gives you the different kind of variables that you can actually, data types that you can actually use to create it. So event name. And then what I'm going to do here in this case is when we pass an events object, I can just do events dot get the event name. Values. I'm going to repeat the same step for the rest of my columns. Events dot get event information. Because what we're doing is we're setting the key to the column name, and then the values is what we're gonna come from our events name once we create an object, which we'll do that later on. So values.put event information. Again, I'm going to do the same thing for values.put events, let's say time. Again, events.get event time. And then the last one is values.put, and then we'll have event, is it information? I've got event venue. And events.get event venue. And then we need to actually now insert it inside the database. So db.insert. And then the first thing that we need to do is Android Studio tells you we need to pass in the table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the table, db table. And then the second thing I'm going to pass in is a null, because we're not going to use any null, column, hack, etc. And then I'm going to pass in my values, content values object. And then what I'm going to do now is I want to check if it's inserted successfully. So what I'll do is I will now create an integer variable, because once you insert something inside a database, it returns you an integer. That integer can be 1, or it can be -1, or it can be 0. If it returns you a number less than 1, it means that there is a problem. But if it returns you 1, it means that it's inserted successfully. So I'm going to store that whatever value or whatever integer it returns back to me. And then I'm going to be able to use that to help me in that sort of sense. Actually, we don't need to do this actually here. We'll do that for the updates. That's why Android Studio is giving me an error, because I'm doing a bit too early. It's meant to use that for the update. Okay, so when we insert it, let's do db close. So we have db close. So this is our add events. Okay, this is our add events method. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create an update address book, update events. Okay, so public void update events. Now we might change that void later on, and I'll tell you why we are going to have to change that later on. So events. What we're going to do now is same step, literally the same step. So in this case, we can even copy this whole code here and bring this here, because we're going to use the same step. The only thing that is going to change is rather than db insert, we're doing db.update. Again, we're going to pass in the db table. We're going to pass in, it requires us to pass in the values at the second time. So we're passing the values and our where clause. Now our where clause is, for example, if I want to change, let's say I have 1,000 rows and I want to change row number 55, I need to say, oh, change, go inside my table, change the values in this column, this column, this column, where my ID is 57. So I need to put in this where clause. And when I put in this where clause, I'm going to pass in a placeholder. So this is how you put a placeholder. This equal sign is you're just doing an ID equals maybe 5 or 6, but rather than writing it just like that, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm just going to pass in equals a question mark, and then a comma, and then the where are the arguments that you're passing in for the clause. So in my case, I will do new string, and then I'm going to do string dot value of. And the reason I'm doing string dot value of is because remember in our events class, or when we created our event class, our IDs are meant to be integers. We can't pass in an integer into a string just like that. We have to convert it. So we have to do string dot value of, and then we can do events dot get ID. So whatever ID we pass in through our object, it would convert into a string and then run our query there. So in this, and then this is where we're going to actually get our end result back equals DB. So if it updates successfully, it will return us a number greater than 0, else less than 1. So what we're going to have is if end result is greater than 0, it means that return true. It means that it's worked successfully, else return false. Now Android Studio is giving me an error because I made this method a void. However, I'm returning something. You can't return anything if you've made a method a void. You have to actually give the data type of which you want it to return by. So I'm going to change that void into a boolean. So this is how we update events in our application. The next thing we want to do is we want to be able to delete, because if we can create where we can add, we also want to be able to delete. But to make the code shorter, because we're going to have repeated code, I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to show you how we can make a delete one. So we just copy it and we just do delete events. And then in this case, what we're going to do is we are going to get rid of this because we're not going to be inserting anything inside the database at this stage. We don't need that. What we're going to have to do now is change the db.update to delete. And then we're going to have to take away these values because the db delete only requests for the table name and also requests for the where clause. And then we're going to keep the ID because we're going to use the IDs we're going to delete from the table using IDs rather. And then I'm going to keep the end results. Again, this is quite simple. If you're able to get to this stage, then you are doing a great job. You're following very well. If you also get stuck, please pause the video, look at the code, go through there, understand it yourself. Like I said, I'm teaching you step by step so that you'll be able to have an understanding of what you're doing. And now we've created inserts, we've created updates, we've created delete. Now we need to create get all, which is we're going to get everything from the database in case we want to get all the information from our database. Now, the reason why we do this is so that we don't have to keep hitting the database each time. So if you return it all in one list, you don't have to go back to the database. You already have it in memory, which you can make manipulations and then do something to it. The downside to that is that if somebody else is accessing your application at the same time, they might update it, but you won't have the current one. You will have an old one because you brought everything out because you're not hitting the database again until you need to do something very, very important. But for the purpose of this, we are doing it this way. So we have public array list. Why? Because I want to return my object in an array list because it will be easier to manage it that way. Because remember, we're bringing everything from the database. So a public array list, and then our array list we're going to pass in is events. And then we are going to call it get all. Now, the reason why is giving me this issue is because I said I'm creating a method which is going to return something, but I haven't actually added a return type to it. But I'll add that at the end of it. So I'm going to create an array list. First thing we do is we create an array list of the events. That is the list. That's the array list that's going to actually we're going to store all the information from the database inside. And then once we created our array list, we want to go to the database. So SQL database DB, this dot, and now usually we've been using this dot get writable database, but for this purpose, we actually don't want to get writable database. Rather, we want to get the information out. So we're going to use get readable database. And then we're going to create a query. So string query equals select all from then our DB table. Now, something that is new, I'm going to be new to if you're watching this tutorial for the first time, is cursor. Now, cursor, once we moved all the information from the database, we need something to store it inside, you know, which it can also keep the columns, it can keep the rows, can keep the everything that how it was in the database. We use cursor. Cursor helps us to store that information in that format for us, so that we'll be able to get access to it in the same way. So we're using cursor, and then with our cursor, we are going to get all the information from the database. We're going to pass in the first argument is our query, and it tells us our string SQL, which is the query that we've created. And then our where clause. We don't have any where clause in this case. Usually we'll put string, and then let's say you only want to get one thing from the database, you can pass in a where clause, but we're going to pass in null because we want to get everything back from the database. And then we're going to import our cursor. Then we're going to say cursor dot move to first. So cursor will always move to the first one. And then we're going to do a while loop. And our while loop is going to check, it's going to say if while the cursor is after the last equals to false, which basically says that if the cursor is not at the last bit, keep looping through. It's not the last row, keep looping through, keep looping through, keep looping through. So once we're looping through our, because now all our data is now in this cursor object that holds all our rows and columns for us. We now need to be able to go through that cursor and then get each column, each value in each column, line by line by line by line by line. And then we're going to create an object of the events and then return that to our application for us to view it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create int column ID. Now cursor dot get int. Why are we getting int? Because remember that column holds integers, because when we created our ID column, we said we wanted integers. So get column index or throw an exception, we're going to pass an ID. So this is going to look at the ID. So while it's going to go through each line by line by line by line by line in our let's pretend that our cursor has the database inside. Think about it that way. It's going to look at once it goes row 1, then it's going to look at column ID. Then it's going to get the value of whatever is in row 1 in the ID column, and it's going to store it inside column ID. And we're going to do the same. We're going to repeat this step for the rest of them as well. So it's going to go to string, then it's going to do, let's call this core 1 just for convention. So get string, and then again, cursor dot get column index or throw. So this will throw an exception in case it's not able to find that column name that we're passing in. That's what we're saying. Throw an exception. It means that column name does not exist. We're going to do the same thing for the rest of them. So events, we want to be able to find event information. String column 3, we want to be able to find the event time. And then again, we want to do events venue, and I want to change this to 4. So now we've managed to get, so for each row, so let's say, for example, the cursor is right now at column 1, at row number 1. We're saying at row number 1, get the value from the ID column, get the value from the event name column, get the value from the event time column, get the value from the event venue, and then store it in these strings and this integer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an object out of it, because remember, we want to create an array of the event object. So we have to now create events. Let's call it E1 equals new events. Now our event constructor requires us to pass in the ID. So we're going to pass in the ID. If you're a bit confused at this stage, remember in our events.java, we created this constructor. And this constructor is what helps us to build an object out of our events. So we have, first thing it's going to ask us ID, event name, event time, event information, and event venue, which is similar to what we have here now. So we just pass in the column ID, we pass in the call1, we pass in the call2, we pass in the call3. I just need to check to make sure I'm passing the right information. So we have the event name. Okay, we've left out. Okay, so event time should rather be here. So let me check what's in column 1. Okay, let me just save myself the trouble. Let me save myself the trouble, because it usually pops up, but let's just have a look at it. So what we have is we have event name. And then the next one was meant to be event time. So let's just change that to event time. So just so that it doesn't confuse somebody later on. And then the next one was event information. So just change that to event information, and then event venue. So column 1, column 2, column 3, and then column 4. And then we can get rid of this. So once we've got this event, so because think about what we're doing at the moment is we're creating an object, and these are the information that we're passing in for that object. Each and every single line, it creates a new object, and then we're going to add that object to our array list. So we're going to pass in E1, and then we're going to say move to the next cursor. So it's going to go through it line by line by line by line until it's added every single row to our array list. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return item. So this code here is what's going to help us with our update events, our add events, our delete events, our events get all. Now, this is quite a simple way of you as a user being able to create a class to help you fine use this. Again, we'll come back to this DB Connect, because we also have to let the user be able to update their first name and last name and this and that. But this would be the same way of doing it, which is repeated thing that we can just use the same code to be able to do. We just have to create a different method and change the table name and the values. That's basically it. So we just finished with our DB Connect at this part of where we can add an event and we can actually delete an event, update an event. And that is it for this video. I will see you in the next video.